But thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I sat down to come up with these questions and I wanted to just be like, I just want to talk. I don't even know, like I have like a million questions for you. So I'm really grateful for you and all that you do to not just support my project, but with your students. And I mean, you're a force on social media and the Furniture Society. And I just really appreciate your leadership.
Oh, thank you. It's funny. I don't think of it as leadership. I sort of feel like usually I'm in the backdrop, but it's become clear to me through teaching for the last 11 years that that there still really isn't an easy place or an easy path for my female identifying and non-binary students to go when they get out of academia. There's starting to be spaces for them in the shop, and certainly like in art school, I think that there's statistically across the country, it's like 70% women in art schools and art programs. But
wow.
Then you get into the trades and it's like 2% women. And
wow.
So that gets really disappointing really fast, because the trades are maybe not where some of my art students want to wind up, but they're a really great place to continue to grow as a woodworker. And some of them do want to go into that. And it's just not a comfortable setting usually for anybody. But I mean, and that's not true across the board. There's some really amazing shops out there and some really amazing people, men and women and non-binary folk, just doing great work. But yeah, so I'm excited that you're here and that places like A Workshop of Our Own exist, and all of these sort of venues that didn't exist even like 3 years ago.
Yeah, it's amazing how, like you said, the past 3 to 5 years, it's like we all found each other and have started to work together and support each other, and it's just been so beautiful how it's blossomed. Because I mean, I've dipped in and out as an artist or maker or writer, and it's like, it's just every time I would come back, it's just like more and more sense of community and people really wanting to help each other. I get recommendations, and not people nominate, they're like, I nominate so and so, and I'm like, oh, it's totally not like that. Just tell me who they are and what they do, and I'll get in touch. But it's very flattering that people want to reach out and share the stories of people they respect, not even just their own as artists, like to share their mentor or someone that's really made a difference. That's been really awesome too, for it to be an avenue for folks to kind of support each other. So, and I get a lot of emails from men, but not like you would think. They're usually like, hey, she's a awesome crafts person, and it's always like really kind. And actually like 40% of my readership is male. So it's nice to know, that there's that strong of like a contingent of the male delegation willing to step in and support. So just trying to find ways that I can make this grow constantly. It has been my passion really for the last year. It's been amazing how out of necessity we've all had to find different things to do, and for various reasons this has just really taken off and taken a part of me. So so thank you for being a part of it. I was just like, keep waiting. I was like, I'm gonna find the right thing. I don't want to just ask her for anything. So
anytime. I'm always happy to participate. I mean, I'm really shy. I don't go outside of my bubble or get outside of my shop or my classroom very much. And the people that I'm like not shy around are other makers. Like when we have something in our hands to be working on, that's when I'm sort of super comfortable. My friend group here will say, like, whenever we have fires outside together, I'm always the one sort of off to the side laughing at what people are saying and whittling because it's like, it's just my way of being around other people and being comfortable. And so I love anything that I can do to connect to people, because I still need that connection. I'm just shy about getting it. So anytime I can do it, through this, I'm like, perfect.
Oh, that's awesome. Because in the virtual meetings and stuff that we've been in, I would totally not take you as a very shy person, but I could see that, it's kind of like my husband, like he's super quiet, but once you get him talking about furniture, like, man, he's like a different person.
Yeah.
But it makes a difference. It makes a difference to find like your group, you know, the people that understand you. And you are always working on something. That's what I love about you. Like your energy is just like, you know, you can feel it through the screen.
It's good. I really do. One of the things that I hope my work does is show how much I love the material and how much I love making, because I think there's this sense that when you get into academia, making art gets joyless. And like, I'm so much about joy, even in pieces that are sad. Like, it's such a joyful thing to me to make work. So anytime I feel like that's getting across, I feel really good.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, it is weird to think of you in the stance of academia, because you do get that feeling of like, okay, it is kind of, you know, theory and this and by the book and just like kind of the basics. And I think, I mean, your work just continues to flourish. And it'll be interesting to see in our conversation, you know, talking about balance and balancing your imagination and balancing form. And also how, I mean, how do you balance an academic job leading and teaching others and still find time to tap in and be a creative person? You know, that takes a lot out of you to teach all day, every day. So it's really remarkable. But anyways, we'll go ahead and get into the questions. So up here. All right. Where do you think your imagination comes from?
This is such a funny question to read. I was like, well, duh, it comes from, and then I was like, I don't know. But actually I think that it was always celebrated in my family. I'm one of 3 kids. I'm the middle of 3. And I wasn't good at school. I didn't learn to read until really late. I have a learning disability. And what was so wonderful about the way that I was raised and the way that my parents sort of approached that was that the imaginative is seen as just as smart and as valuable as sort of like the book smarts that we kind of think about as being kind of like the notion of like what an education is all about books, right? It's all about sort of being able to not memorize, but to sort of take in and analyze facts. And, you know, I was always often left field, like, you know, what if the sky were green? And they would think that that was just as intelligent or as valuable, I guess, as the other academic sort of parts of growing up and learning. And so I think some of it comes from just being allowed to be imaginative. And then I do think that sort of I'm naturally inclined toward being a little bit of a dreamer. And like, I think growing up in a family that really valued education and really valued reading, even though I couldn't read for a long time. My dad read to me, and he actually read to the whole family because they got in on it as soon as he started going, and they realized he could do all the voices. Everybody would sit around when I got read to at night. And, you know, I think that there's just, with a book, when you're being read to or when you're reading, you're having to do a lot of the work yourself. You know, you're having to imagine the characters, right? And the settings, and that is just a huge machine to get started in your mind. And I think once you start that, especially if you start it young, it's really hard to turn off. And the thing that typically turns it off, I think, is like that sort of weird conservative thing that happens to everybody when they get into high school, you know? And I was not great in school still. In high school, the thing that I had, like always had, was that I had this good imagination. And so I was just it was allowed for me to kind of let it flourish. And I do think one of the things that's sometimes a little bit hard is that when people are really naturally good at um, sort of any academic pursuit or sport or what have you, if they have a sort of a natural ability, they're pushed toward that. And what was lovely for me is that I didn't have any sort of like anything else. I was allowed to just be alive in my imagination and in the artwork that I wanted to make when I was a kid. And I didn't sort of get shuffled off, and I wasn't a brilliant scientist, right? So I didn't get shuffled off into sciences. I just was allowed to pursue the thing I wanted to pursue fully. And I do think often if someone's good at arts and something else, it's the something else that wins. So I hope that changes. But for me, it worked out perfectly. I'm terrible at everything else, so I was allowed to have a great imagination. And I've never turned it off, which has been great.
That's amazing. I would agree with you. At that age of like middle school, getting into high school, you're kind of really observant, like self-conscious of yourself, what's going on, what's going to, it's almost like survival instinct. It's like, do I want to stand out in the herd and get eaten? Like, I don't know about that. So I love that so many of us have turned it off. I mean, there was a part of me in college, like when I felt like I could start turning it back on, and I was like, oh no, where did it go? Like, is it still there? I like legitimately panicked. And it was hard to get back into that and trust that and like allow that part of yourself to flourish and be like, okay, and it's safe now, and to trust that. So what were some ways that you kept it going during your younger years? That is a tough age to discover, hey, like, I don't think like everybody else.
Yeah, there you go. Drawing. I mean, when I went to art school, but before that, even my introduction to sort of making was to draw, because that was what the classes focused on in my school. There wasn't a shop class, and stage crew too. I did build, but I was building on sets. I don't even want to think about some of the things that we did to like construct. Like that table saw was on wheels and we didn't lock them down ever. I'm like, oh God, good thing we're all still alive. It was fine. But mostly it was drawing. It was sort of like doodling and drawing everywhere on everything all of the time. And reading. When I learned how to read, and sort of got up to speed, and I'm still really slow at it. And I have had trouble reading for the last few years. But that's unrelated. But I think reading is such a huge way to keep your imagination going, to stay creative and to stay active in that way, and to recognize that like the group of people that you're around all the time are not the only people on earth. Right? That there are all these other ways of being in the world. And, reading sort of gives you access to that. You're reading along and you're thinking, okay, I am this character. And then you're like, oh, I'm Chinese, in this book, or, oh, I'm an old man. And it's wonderful because you sort of become the characters. And I don't know, I think it allows you to be incredibly creative and empathetic too. I think creativity and empathy are sort of linked.
Wow. Yes. So it's interesting. I've personally had issues reading the last couple of years. I get vestibular migraines, which makes processing some things like kind of hard, confusing. And reading is something I've really missed. So me personally, this year I've picked out a few books that I know I really want to read, and I'm just going to give myself time and space to get through them. I see, people are like, I read 24 books last year. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I can barely read the nutrition facts on the side of the cereal box. Like, so, but I agree with you that I think reading, I mean, it really does let you transcend to these different places, these different beings, just face different problems than what you're facing right now. And that is a huge part, I think, of being a creative person, is being able to find that escape. So awesome. Yeah. All right. So you've kind of already answered this question. have you always had an active imagination? But better, what is your earliest creative memory?
It was funny. I was thinking about this, and I did the Why Make podcast not too long ago, and I talked about this experience that I had when I was probably in grade school. I was little, but I had two friends, and their names were Tom, and I can't remember the other kid's name right now. These two boys and I would play submarines on the playground, and we had turned the entire playground into a big submarine. And there was the main engine room and all this stuff. And we knew what it all looked like. And we would do drawings of the control panels and, like tape them up inside the playground. But I actually think that my first real creative act was listening well to somebody else reading a story and building that world, building my understanding of those characters in my mind. I think like, Roald Dahl was sort of the main author that my dad read over and over again. And so sort of like being Sophie in the BFG, and being able to imagine with the help of Quentin Blake's gorgeous illustrations, what those characters look like. Or being like in A Wrinkle in Time, being Meg, like, and sort of like creating that whole world. Of course, the authors do all of the work writing it down, but then you're asked to sort of imagine it. And I think that's a pretty huge creative feat. And I think especially when you this is so odd for me to say because I draw and I make objects, but when you have just words and you have to create the images yourself. So when you move past picture books into word books and suddenly you're doing the job, right? Of illustrating it for yourself, that's such a huge creative act. So I think that actually has to be the answer for that.
Wow, that's a great answer. And I don't really, you don't think about it that way, because I'm like, well, that's kind of what I do here. I interview people and listeners like, I don't think of myself as creating, but you're right. You're sharing ideas and creating a new way of looking at things. I mean, this creating at the very, core of it all. That's amazing. I love that. I love that a lot.
Last night, so I have to say I've had time to think about it. I had time to like get a smart answer and not be like,
oh gosh. See, and I didn't think I'd given you enough time. I thought, oh gosh, it's like less than 24 hours.
No, it's totally.
All right. So why do you think you were pulled towards woodworking and furniture making, especially with your imagination? I'd love to hear this.
Well, I probably would have done it sooner, I think. But when I got to art school, I had to go through a first year sort of foundation program, which was a painting class and a photography class and a drawing class and a sculpture class, which was stone carving, woodworking, welding, and one other thing. Maybe we had to cast stuff and plaster. I blocked that out of my memory because I so hate those kinds of materials. I love the results. I love what other people can do with them. But if I'm like, you mean I have to put my hands into something liquid? Gross. I'm like so not into it. Totally not into it. Or if the material is soft or stretchy, I'm like, no, it's not. So I think some of the answer is that I think we have kind of a natural, Tom Loser used this really great language to talk about some of the work he's interested in when he pulled some work from the permanent collection at the Center for Art in Wood in Philadelphia. There's too many centers. And he called it material intelligence. And I think we sort of all have our own material intelligences, our own abilities to like almost empathize with materials. And for me, I don't know that I naturally had that with wood, but I loved the material. I loved the softness of it. And I love the sort of immediacy of mark making with woodworking. It reminds me of drawing, actually. with woodworking, you're always working with your parts. You don't put them in a kiln and then hope they don't explode. You don't put them into chemical and wait for your picture to appear. What you do to the surface is literally what the surface looks like. And it feels like making marks on a page in a sort of a roundabout way. They have kind of similarly immediate relationships to our hands and to what we're doing. And so I think it's sort of related to me that way. And then again, the sort of softness or like the familiarity with the material, it's everywhere and it's warm. And I love those things about it. And I think on a really kind of a selfish level, not selfish, but a real personal level, like there are really relatively few times when we feel like we can control our surroundings. We sort of live in these cubes, and then when something goes wrong with those cubes, we have to call an expert to come in and fix whatever has gone wrong all the time. And when you start learning how to work with wood, all of a sudden you're like, I can affect changes in this cube. And I think as a young woman, that's huge. It's like, I could cut that window in half if I felt so inclined. I could do this, I could do that. I mean, there's just like such a sense of agency when you start being able to woodwork, and to understand how that material works, that I really loved and responded to. So that's, I mean, it didn't pull me toward it like, I didn't have a sense of like what it could do for my imagination. I had a sense of how I felt about the material itself. And then because I love it, I think I've been able to like warp it to my own weird devices a lot, and figure out how to manipulate it in such a way that sort of gets back to the imaginative things that I am interested in. I could have gone into small metals. I could very easily have gone into printmaking. I love those things, but wood is sort of, it's so ubiquitous, it's so warm, and it's this scale that feels like very much like human scale. There's something very humanistic about it. So that's not a very good answer. That was a long-winded answer to not give you a proper answer.
No, it's fine because it sends me off on these tangents that I hope make sense in my responses. But, I can see in your work just how you, even just watching you like recently on Instagram, like layering paint, trying to figure this out, like seeing the layers in your work, like talking about the mark making and kind of the drawing creative side. It just flows so seamlessly into the woodworking side. And so I can see where it just is like a perfect marriage for you. It's almost kind of hard to see where you've stopped, where it's creativity, where it's you, and then where it's the wood. And like, because so many times in woodworking, I think it's easy to feel kind of like restricted. And I don't feel that looking at your work.
Yeah.
So it comes through very beautifully. So thank you. That did make sense. So, and that brings me to my next question. You're very expressive in your work, but a lot of pieces also have a functional purpose. And you also mentioned relating to humans, and like so much of your work is big, to me is big. What's that relationship like? Is it symbiotic? Is it a smooth balance? Or do you ever find yourself kind of at odds with that?
I love this question because from my side, I sort of feel like I'm always like, what am I doing? And so it's interesting to hear, somebody who sees just the finished work or who sees the process kind of staged in the way we stage things through Instagram, like not intentionally. I try and show, like when I'm struggling with the finish, I try and show some of that because the struggle is real. But I did struggle with it, especially early on. In my work, there's this sort of idea of what a fine woodworker does, and what sort of what furniture does for us and what function does. And I think I landed in like the perfect place because I landed in an art school learning woodworking, as opposed to landing in a cabinet shop learning woodworking or an apprenticeship learning woodworking. I don't think I would have thrived in those areas. And the art school sort of had two advantages for me. One, people showed me how to do things as I sort of needed to do them, or I figured them out on my own because there was nobody around to tell me like what I was doing wrong. And so I was able to kind of invent my own language of woodworking a little bit. Nothing I do is new, but I pull a lot of techniques from like vernacular architecture, like from barns and buildings and things that I can see around me that are constructed. And I always thought, well, like if you could screw a building together, like why on earth can't I screw this piece of furniture together? And so I sort of, I was very early on given permission to make things the way that I want to make them because I was in sort of an art scenario, as opposed to like in a fine furniture program where somebody would be like, really, a screw, you know, like that should be dovetailed. And so that's been really helpful. And in terms of like what the pieces do, I've been talking to my grad students a lot about this because I'm sort of interested in being in a traditionally craft material in a very academic fine art art department, an amazing art department. But I think we sometimes feel like we're at odds because of the materials that we use and the kinds of forms that we're interested in making and the way we think about function. But I don't actually think it needs to be at odds at all. And one of the things that I think crafts does beautifully is it gives you a process to work through that's slow. And so you can sort of start to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it as you're doing it, because it's going to take a long time. So when I start with my pieces, I sometimes don't even know if they're going to be like an actual functional object or if it's going to be like sort of more purely conceptual or sculptural. They almost always do something. They function in some way, but sometimes that's really conceptual, and sometimes it's much more sort of like, this is actually a desk that you could sit at. And I don't always know when I start which direction I'm going. But as I'm working with the pieces, I'm letting my hands lead the way. You know, I'm thinking literally with my hands, and I'm interested in a form or a mechanism or a shape or some new process that I want to try. And I'll get maybe 10% of the way through it, and I'll start to think, oh, this is so beautiful. Wouldn't it be neat if there were a cavity in here that held something? And then, 20% of the way through, I find something that feels like it should be in that piece. And then I spend the next 80% of the piece kind of thinking about why I think there's a relationship between the object I'm containing and the piece that's containing it, which then informs all of the other decisions in it. So hopefully the pieces feel like they're purposeful and very, they sort of were linear and always had a direction because they're the opposite, because I intuitively built them and made choices based on what the piece was actually telling me as it was out in space, as it was getting built. I was like, oh, this needs to be taller, or, oh, this needs to have a drawer in it, or, whatever. So it's lovely because it's a nice, I don't know, for me, I could never have a brilliant idea and then go and make it. I don't have brilliant ideas. I have like terrible ideas, or like little niblets of ideas, and then my hands kind of like move through the process of making that happen. And I feel like sometimes my hands are like hitting my head, like, wake up, dummy, come on, this is we're doing this for this reason. And then somewhere it's in there, I'm like, oh, it's for this reason, let me talk about it intelligently in an artist statement. But that's not how it starts. So
Oh Lord, the dreaded artist statement. No, that's wild. That's wild to me. I mean, I guess as a maker, like put a lot of pressure on myself, probably, um, starting on a piece, like what a, like how refreshing to be able to like step up to something new and just be like, let it come to me. Like that's amazing. This is so cool. I'm getting like just a little bit of insight into your brain, and it is fantastic. I love it.
It's not always useful. Like the finish on the thing that I'm working on now, it's so obvious to me now that it needed to be the way that it is. But if you don't know where you're going, that's not obvious, or it wasn't to me. And then I'll do something and I'll be like, that was a terrible idea. And so a lot of the surfaces that are like super rich and just have like a lot of layers of history on them, they have that because I made like 100 mistakes and I edited by adding, to the surface until it became the thing that I wanted. And unfortunately, I really like that look. So I'm sort of doomed to repeat it always.
I love that though. Just like you were given space to kind of develop yourself, you're giving yourself space to make creative choices and explore and make mistakes and find lovely things that you wouldn't be able to think of ahead of time. You can only discover by doing. So, wow, I love that. Very cool. All right. So, do you ever feel stuck in your creative process? You kind of explained, you work through some things that you don't like by adding, that's how you edit. So any other ways that you have to kind of like shake yourself loose sometimes?
Totally. And, we talked a tiny bit about this at the very beginning, but, my job now is split between helping students make their work teaching, it's like so many emails, and committee work, service to the institution, service to the field, and then making my work. And if I haven't been in the shop for like a week, I'll be like, well, I'm not an artist anymore. I've forgotten how to do this. And usually I'll go in with that feeling like I don't belong. And the way that I try to mitigate that, or like sort of keep, because I'm somebody who needs momentum, and I just know that I need momentum to go. The way that I try and keep that is through like a really constant sketchbook practice. Like I'm like always like every day in my sketchbook. So I go through one of these books every 6 months or so. And then the other way is I work small a lot, because the bigger pieces are frustratingly slow. And I think sometimes with the bigger pieces, you probably have experienced this too. Like, you're like, oh, I have 45 minutes. That's not enough for me to even set up. Like, it's not, I need a full day to even remember where I was on this piece. Even when I was in grad school, but definitely now, I'm always working on like little things. Bandsaw boxes used to be like my number one, and they were a really great way to kind of keep me active, keep my hands in the game, explore finishes, kind of discover new shapes or forms on this tiny scale. And if they were terrible, it didn't matter. I could just throw them away, whatever. And right now it's brushes. Brushes have been just this wonderful. Aspen Golan, who you interviewed last year,
Yeah, last year.
Gave us this amazing demo right at the start of quarantine, like back a year ago in March. And I was so grateful to her for showing this new technique. And something about the brushes let me feel like I could be really sculptural in a subtractive way. I don't carve a lot and haven't carved a lot. But I think because they're objects held in the hand, it made sense. So I've started making brushes, and that has been a really wonderful way to kind of keep my hands in the game. And even on the bigger pieces, there's this sort of bricolage sort of feel to them. They're always compiled out of smaller parts. And so even if I don't have a small thing going, or a group of small things going in the shop, each piece has several pieces. And so I can work on part of it and then work on another. So getting unstuck for me is about having multiple things going and knowing that I'm going to get stuck on a piece. and having something else to work on. Because I think if you get stuck and you stop, there's almost no way to get unstuck. But if you get stuck and you keep going elsewhere, your mind is still sort of trying to figure out that problem, and it will eventually get you out of the rut.
Yeah, it'll catch up and keep it going, and then that one will come up from behind. And no, it's a good point about the bigger pieces, because that was part of the reason why I was like, all right, I got to find smaller stuff to do. Like, I knew for my own personal limitations, I wasn't going to be a furniture maker forever. But then I was also like, I found myself getting distracted very easily, and the satisfaction of making something small, more quickly. So I love that you take, the smaller parts and make them, put them together to be the bigger pieces, because it can feel very intimidating, especially I remember as like a new artist, like, oh, we're going to build this big thing, and it almost kind of becomes a mountain. And you're right. If you are doing one thing and you get stuck and stop, you aren't moving. And all you can do is focus on the brick or whatever is in your way, So that's a very good point. And having smaller items is a good way to keep it up, keep it mixing it up. I think Aspen saved us all with her brush tutorial. It might be a much different place now if we hadn't have gotten that. She really helped out on that.
At least it's very well swept, for sure.
Oh gosh, I love it. I love it. I love it. See, I worry sometimes I'm too punny, but then I get to talk to y'all in person. I'm like, okay, yes, just like me. One of us. One of us.
I love puns. My students will tell you.
It's almost like you can't be a woodworker without some sort of small appreciation for puns, So
great.
All right. Well, we're kind of getting to the end here. Where are your creative interests currently? Where do you see them leading you in the future? Do you have anything that's really like catching your eye right now, or something you'd like to explore next?
Yeah, I have, I've sort of exploded a little bit this year. And so I have like 8 or 12 pieces planned. Like the next sort of set of things exists already, or the starts of them do, because they'll hopefully lead me in directions I can't even imagine. I don't usually feel like this jazzed or this excited about the directions that I'm going, but doing those smaller brush carvings got me really excited about playing with form in a way that I have not before. So I've been carving the base of this sort of table structure. It's a drawer box that holds a branch, but anyway, it has siblings. So there will be at least 3 of these sort of carved objects that are a little bit taller, these sort of base forms that are anthropomorphic-ish, but maybe 3-legged. So they maybe reference animal or animal-like, but they're not any specific animal. And then I'm wrapping up this cabinet form that I've been working on and sort of sharing. And that has all of these eyes that open on it. I've been thinking a lot about watchfulness and awareness, and the eyes have become this sort of metaphor for when we talk about working with art, we say that we're interacting with it, which implies an awareness on both parties, right? The art and the viewer. And I think I'm sort of interested in like playing with that by having pieces that when you interact with them, they literally sort of appear to wake up, to stare back at you. And so there's a series of pieces that do that. And I had thought that they were all going to look a certain way. And of course I'm working on this one and I'm like, no, it'll be like this and it'll be like this. So I'm excited about that. But I would say like the thing that I'm kind of most jazzed about or most excited about right now are these sort of carved forms, because my illustrations have always been very much like sort of these profile drawings of something, and the works have very much been that way too. Even the curved works were always curved just in one direction. It's easier to build that way, but it's also just sort of the way I see. There's kind of a flatness to my drawings that's translated into this kind of interesting flatness in the work, that I can then sort of mitigate by texture and weird things happening on the surface. But my drawings in the last few years have been more anthropomorphic and people-like, and I've started to do a lot more shading. And I think that, like, again, like getting the brush demo when I did, and thinking about carving a lot. And I always teach my students how to carve by hand. That's the first thing I show them, so that they understand wood grain, and a sharp knife. And doing that for so many years, I think I'm now ready to translate that onto a bigger scale with my work. And so that's just been really, really wonderful to get into. And it's still all hand tools. I haven't done any power carving, partly because my space isn't set up for it. It would just be a dust ball in here, and I'd make me sad. But I really love the word that came to mind was intimacy, but the quietness of working with hand tools to shape a piece, which sounds like really romantic from a person who is not like a romantic type woodworker. Like, I don't talk about the romance of woodworking very much, but again, I think, like, if we're talking about joy in the making, like, that's where it is right now for me, is this sort of like this action of working with some very lovely hand tools. I just got into spoke shades and some rounded bottomed planes, and so I'm just loving working with those tools. So
That's awesome. Yeah, you like to explore. I don't even want to call it the dark side of woodworking, because it's not dark. It's just, it's playful, it's fun, it's just a different place. It's kind of like where, other people are afraid to go, and you're kind of like bringing these lights, and they're not, I can't even like call them monsters, because your work doesn't like scare me or anything. It's really charming, and it is intriguing, and it is almost like getting in, like sucked into your world. Like, you see your piece, and it just kind of, you just can't help. It's like reading a book. You want to keep reading the story. You want to interact. You want to see more. So yes, I can totally get that. But I also understand the peacefulness of carving. I don't know if you're familiar with Mary May, but she's a good friend of mine. And like the last thing I did before lockdown was drop in on her class at the Charleston Woodworking School. And I thought, oh man, I'm so glad I did that. Like, so glad that I just had that moment of like belonging and feeling like she's such a good teacher. But the act of carving itself, like it is, you have to get to know the grain very well, very, very well. You have to know your wood. I would say more, I'm trying to think of the right word. It's like you have to know what's inside of it, even though you don't really, you really do have to do a lot of learning to be able to do good carving techniques and to do what you want and not just hack it to death like I probably did. But that's wonderful. So I'm loving what you're working on now, and it's interesting you talk about the flatness too. That's why I loved having this conversation with you, because all these things in your work that I point out, I'm like, God, that kind of looks like that to me, and to hear you describe it is just amazing. So I know listeners are going to just be really thrilled with this conversation and wishing that we could keep on talking, and we'll find other things to chat about, I'm sure. So
maybe in South Carolina, I grew up in Virginia, but summer's always on Edisto Island.
So. That's right. We're actually trying to plan how we can sneak away down there, since Joseph and I got our first vaccination yesterday. We're like, right, 6 weeks. we're going, we want to go to the beach, and that way we can still keep the kids kind of isolated. And Edisto, you've got the pig. That's it.
That's it. Nothing else. Except, is it still the pig? I think it's not an IGA. What is it?
It's not a BILO. It might be a BILO.
I think it's a BILO. You're right.
Ah, man. So where we live, so it's a little town called Utahville. We don't have a stoplight or anything. We somehow have one of the few remaining Piggly Wigglies nearby in Holly Hill. So sometimes I go there just because it's the pig and I want to keep it alive.
I will admit that I have like an embarrassingly large number of T-shirts that say stuff like "I'm big on the pig."
Yes,
it's good grocery store.
I was gonna say, if you didn't have one, we were gonna get you one and mail it up to you.
We got them. When we found out the pig was going, my mom was like, "We're gonna buy every T-shirt."
I love it. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to discuss or share, or something we didn't cover?
I mean, it was just so lovely to talk. I think that, I am really excited about what you're doing for the community. And I was in a conversation with a bunch of wonderful folks who work for or are on the board of a workshop of our own. And Chelsea Witt was saying, oh man, Katie Thompson gets like these people that are outside of sort of the academic setting of crafty crafters that we know. Not that that's not an absolutely wonderful circle. Of course it is. It's our, it's our family, but you're sort of like introducing everybody to makers, who are in the trades and just from a huge range of different backgrounds and interests. And I appreciate that. And I really love it. So thank you for all of your hard work.
Well, thank you for the support. I mean, sometimes I've felt like early on, I was like, I'm just writing into the abyss, maybe someday someone will read this and find it interesting. Maybe not. It started as a passion project, and I think people pick up on that and they gravitate towards that. And that's why it's been so fun to watch it grow and get to meet wonderful people. I can't wait for the world to open back up so we can go to conferences and share those real in-life moments. But especially, I know you're teaching a lot and probably talking to people all day long. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and have a cup of coffee with me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It was my pleasure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Katie, and have a wonderful weekend.
You too. I'm glad this is your last Zoom thing.
Yes. Especially after the vaccine yesterday, I was like, you know what? It's 72 and sunny outside. I just want to be on my porch. I just want to be on my porch.
We're actually even in the 50s today, I think, here in Wisconsin, but we're supposed to get snow in a week. So
I was going to say that's tropical for Wisconsin right now.
It is 100% tropical. I have been absolutely grateful for the weather here this winter. We had 2 weeks of below zero every day. And I was like muscling through it. And then I heard somebody who was local, I am local now, but somebody who'd been there for years complain. And I was like, oh, thank God I can complain too. And I was like, this is terrible. They're like, it is, but it gets better. We made it through. And now I understand why there are people out in their like underwear when it gets to be 50 degrees here, because they're so excited about sunshine actually touching their skin that they're like, I don't care. I don't care what it is. I'm going out there and I'm going to be half naked. So
that reminds me, we used to do a lot of shows in Chicago, and we were up there. It was like 16 below when, just like super, super freezing. And there's people out like in their running shorts, like total, like sun was out. They were fine. And I'm like half frozen over here. If it gets below 68 in the house, I'm like, oh, I got to put on a sweater. It's getting chilly.
Yeah, I'm the same way. And I actually really like humidity. I think because the house my grandmother's house on Edisto was unair conditioned. So, like spending August in a house in South Carolina that's unair conditioned, I just like, I'm kind of like, I don't feel right if the air doesn't feel like I'm actually standing in somebody's mouth. You know, I just need it to be that gross outside. Otherwise, I don't feel good. I just feel like, and I have friends who are from California who are like, that's disgusting. Why does it feel like the air is actually touching me? I don't like it.
Yeah, it's kind of like I always imagine it's like Stranger Things and like the upside down, like having to kind of shove this like goo away. That's what it feels like. Only my friends from New Orleans can relate. You know, they're like, oh yeah, you know, that's the only place it's worse, I think, than South Carolina. So
I have never
yeah.
been. I'll look forward to someday experiencing that level of kind of gross air. It'll be great.
That's probably why drinking is such a big deal in New Orleans and Charleston and Savannah and those places. That's probably the only way a lot of people can make it through.
It's fair. It's fair.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Katie.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
All right. Take care.
You too.